Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Beyond Funding, our podcast series. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Kat Osborn, who is the CEO of Safe Families. Hello Kat, how are you today?
All right? Really well, thank you. Great to be with you.
You're CEO of Safe Families. Could you tell us a little bit about Safe Families and your vision?
Absolutely. So Safe Families believe that no one should feel alone. And I think all of us can probably identify those moments in our lives where if it hadn't been for the support of good friends, neighbours, aunts, grandparents, our own stories might look really different. And that's what we exist for, to enable that support, hope, belonging around families who are isolated, who are feeling overwhelmed by what's going on for them, and enable them to thrive. And we do that with and through the support of an incredible network of volunteers who basically play the role of a good friend, neighbour, aunt, grandparent around families.
Yeah. Brilliant. And recently, I know that you've been looking at a merger with Home for Good, and obviously they're an incredible organisation as well. So could you tell us a little bit about Home for Good, their vision, obviously how you align, and ultimately how that will really benefit the people that you help and support?
Yeah, big question.
Sorry, there's a lot in there, isn't there?
But yeah, so Home for Good have a vision to ensure there is a safe, nurturing home for every child that needs one. And so you can then see how our two organisations come together. Safe Families working to prevent children from coming into care, to put support, hope and belonging around families where needs are escalating. And Home for Good making sure that if the worst happens, if those children do need a different home away from their birth family, there are those homes for them. But also that those families who step into that call to foster and adopt also have the support they need around them to enable them to continue to thrive. Because that is a huge task to take on as well when you make that commitment.
And it sounds like there's a really kind of, in terms of the journey that a lot of families and young people might go through, it sounds like between Safe Families and Home for Good, you actually have that support right the way through the journey from, so it's quite a holistic approach, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really hoping to meet that life cycle needs of the child and the family that they are in. But also enabling everybody to recognise that they can respond. So whether it's from an hour that you're going to give to a child where you might take them out to the park to play football to help that family that are struggling and overwhelmed feel supported, through to that call to foster and adopt. So it's almost circular in two directions. Circular for the child and their family, they're both prevention and support in care, but also for the volunteer, that there's this complete range of ways that we can get involved and make a difference for children across our nation.
So I mean, obviously the alignment seems absolutely perfect. So how did that start? Had you worked together as organisations before? So how did that idea come to you guys?
Yeah, so interestingly, we're actually both about 10 years old as charities, both celebrated our 10th birthdays in the last 12 months, and have at many points across the years kind of looked at how on the ground can we work together. We're both charities that primarily are about activating and inspiring the church, and so how do we make it easier for the church to interact with both of us when actually our message is how do you get involved with the vulnerable children in your community. So we've done events together. And then probably about 2 years ago, we started looking a bit more deliberately in London, like could we have a joint role? So your church leader or church community don't have to speak to two of us. Actually, we organise ourselves better and make it easier for the church to get involved. So that's what we started looking at as a pilot in London. And then our chairs got into a conversation and they were like, maybe we should take this a step further. And so, then myself and Tan, as the two chief execs with our chairs, continued that conversation, and it felt right and exciting and brave and a lot of work, but absolutely about saying how can we speak to the church with one voice, how can we speak to power and government with one voice, a space that probably Home for Good had much more experience in than Safe Families, and ultimately have a better outcome for children as a result.
Oh, fantastic. And just to sort of move on and understand a little bit about the challenges that families face. So what are the kind of key kind of challenges or triggers that, families face now that, might make them struggle more? Yeah,
so I think, there's so much going on for families, but some of the key things I think that are meaning things are harder now than they were are poverty. So 30% of children are living in poverty now, and that's increasing. and then isolation. So it's interesting when we look at Safe Families journey, we started out with a mission statement that was we want to reduce the flow of children into care. And then about which absolutely is still one of our aims, but about 5 years ago we looked at, when we look at all the families we're working with, what's the root cause? And it was isolation and trauma. So I feel like it's this complex picture of increased poverty, cost of living crisis, but with that layered on families who have kind of got generations of trauma and are now way more isolated than they used to be. And so the particular piece of that we want to speak into is the isolation. If we can mean that people aren't going through, whether it's, you know, domestic abuse, mental health issues, poverty, they're not going through that on their own. It has been such a key thing to making a difference for them.
And I know, I mean, you know, the pandemic seems a while ago now, but are we still seeing the effects? Did that have an impact on families?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. It did, but actually, I think one of the missing stories from the pandemic is that for some families, and this definitely wasn't across the board, they had this incredible time as a family unit. Like parents were home because they were furloughed from work, people who were trying to hold down 3 jobs to make ends meet, and children who struggle with school because of trauma, they actually had quality time as a family that in kind of the normal day-to-day wasn't happening. And I'm definitely not saying that was everyone's experience, but I do think that's one of the untold stories of the pandemic. We saw children who were too anxious to leave the house to get to school actually begin to thrive in their family, go out and play on their bike. And yeah, there were some beautiful moments that happened. Another story that I loved about COVID was one of our older volunteers. I think she was in her 70s and had volunteered with this family. And during the pandemic, she then had to isolate. And it was the family that she had supported as a volunteer with Safe Families that were then the people that took her food parcels and enabled her to be connected in a time. So I just love the reciprocity of that, and how actually the family that had been helped became the people that were helping one of our volunteers. So yeah, I mean, definitely there are statistics around kind of school achievement and things that have shown the negative side of the pandemic, but I love those stories of hope that are woven in there.
So obviously you do a lot to support families that are struggling, that are hitting crisis points. So for families that are nearing that, are there things that can be done to sort of, you know, help them before they get to crisis point? What kind of things could be done?
Yeah, I guess we believe deeply in the power of belonging. One of the things when we talk about isolation that we talk about is this sort of cycle of loneliness. So when someone is isolated, doesn't have positive support networks, often with that comes anxiety or a sense of shame, and then from there can become some self-destructive behaviours, which increases their isolation and their sense of shame and their anxiety, and it can be this kind of circle that spirals downwards. But we have seen again and again the power of one consistent reciprocal friendship to bring hope into that, and to suddenly mean someone thinks, oh no, maybe I am worth something. Like if this person's willing to give up their time, they're not paid to do it, to love me, maybe I'm worth loving. And that begins to kind of fight against that sense of shame and anxiety and enable them to believe in themselves. And from there, like almost anything's possible. So obviously there are practical needs, there are mental health needs, but really the bit that we're uniquely, I guess, trying to hone in on is that sense of belonging, of enabling people to feel seen, heard, valued, understood, and then see them reach their own potential because of that. And actually once they can do that, some of that practical stuff, actually they can deal with for themselves because they've got that hope and that sense of belief and that self-efficacy to be able to make the changes that they might need to.
So it does sound quite like, so there are so many issues that people can try to address or deal with, but it sounds like you found a very good approach, which is, you know, if you kind of start with isolation and if you can address that and help people with that, then actually the rest of the things that they have to cope with seem that little bit easier. Is that a good understanding of it?
No, I think so. One of our core values is empowerment and that belief that everybody has the potential to thrive. And so it's not about fixing stuff for them. It's not about solving some of those practical problems. It's about enabling them to know they can do that themselves, because they've got people standing alongside them, standing with them, saying, I believe in you, I know you can do it, I'm here alongside you, going to champion you. And seeing people believe in themselves.
So just looking at, so there are families who sadly will break up because that's the journey they're on. Now, if families are in that situation, then presumably they would approach the care system. So what's the current state of the care system?
Yeah, I think the care system is fractured. Some might go as far as to say broken. There are more children in our care system now than ever before, so over 100,000 children in care. And interestingly, the growing numbers are around that older age group. So a quarter of children in the care system are 16 plus, which is a really significant percentage, and raises some new challenges. So that means there need to be more people willing to foster that older age group, who do come with bigger challenges often, or more awareness of schemes like supported lodgings. And then the other big challenge is that often when children are placed in the care system, there aren't the right homes in the community that they're in. And so a huge percentage of children are relocated to further than 20 miles away. So their school changes, their dentist changes, everything about their routine changes, as well as being separated from their birth family. And so the trauma becomes layered, and the impact of that is really complex. So, but yet within that, we know there are really passionate and committed social workers and foster carers and adopters who are incredibly trauma informed and providing fabulous homes for children. We just need more of that, and we need a system that is joined up and connected and talking to each other well, and a government that are willing to invest in early intervention.
And so I suppose if you were able to ask the government for something, what would you ask for?
I think it would be that investing in early intervention. Josh McAllister's Care Review talks a lot about and really outlines a plan to government for what they could do, and he is now MP for Cumbria, I believe. So hopefully we might see some of these changes in the coming years with the new government. But yeah.
And whatever sort of like insight or stats you look at, the message always is that actually if you can get involved, if help can be available earlier, then often people don't even get to that full crisis point, do they? And you can avert that. So it's much better for everybody, isn't it?
It is, and it needs brave decision making, because it is harder to evidence the difference you're making when you invest early. If you're working right at the edge of care, you are more able to prove that you've stopped children going into care, but we need those brave decision makers now more than ever.
With that in mind, so with Safe Families and Home for Good, in what ways are you addressing that kind of shortage, that gap?
Yeah, well, one of the key things, so I mentioned about that age group, the 16 plus, and how a quarter of children in the care system are in that age group. One of the big things we've been putting energy into is around caring for teenagers. So there's a thing called supported lodgings, which I don't know if you've heard about, which is really foster care for 16 plus. And actually through the work that Home for Good have done in raising the profile of supported lodgings and other actors in the sector, the number of local authorities doing supported lodgings has increased by about 30% over the last few years, which is amazing. And so, interesting, I've become a supported lodgings host. Wow. So last September had a then 17-year-old, now 18-year-old move in with me, which has its own stories, but is brilliant. But we really want to raise the profile of that as a way to provide homes that are safe and stable, and really bridge the gap for that age group between maybe foster care or residential care or a home life that is challenging into independence. And actually, if we can grow the number of supported lodgings hosts and the awareness of it, then we think we can make a really big difference in that space. And we've actually got a report that's about to come out, which is probably the first of its type. So through the Supported Lodgings National Network, which we were key in starting, we've done this research piece of work, which is about getting the voice of those in supported lodgings. And one of the key findings from that is that people weren't aware of it. It's just there's not enough known about supported lodgings as an option for young people to even choose it. So we want to continue to get that on the agenda, to raise awareness of it so we have more hosts, but also ensure there aren't any local authorities in the country that don't have a supported lodging scheme, because we know that that home-based environment is often the best way for teenagers to thrive.
That's great. So the longer the people are in the care system, does it mean that they face more challenges, because obviously isolation, dislodgement, that kind of thing has been going on for longer? So do they face more challenges? Is it a little bit more difficult?
Not necessarily. So interestingly, my experience from the teenager that I'm hosting as a supported lodgings host is that actually he's had a really good experience of the care system.
Yeah.
He has ADHD, but he's really regulated. He's had really good support, and he was in residential care for a period, but it's been a really positive outcome for him, and he's now through supported lodgings in this transition time. So yes, there are statistics that say if even entering into the care system for a really short period of time often impacts lots of the stats around future and opportunities. But I think what we want to ensure is that there are safe, loving, nurturing homes everywhere across the country, so that everybody's experience is like that of the young person that I'm hosting, and they don't have that dislocation or kind of re-traumatized by the system that should be caring for them.
And brilliant. And I would imagine that you have lots of great stories about the people that you've helped, be they families or young people. So are there any that particularly stand out to you that you're happy to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So many.
Yeah,
I could probably fill the whole podcast with stories. So let me share one. So this was a mum of 6 children, aged 4 to 14. The oldest was being groomed by a gang and potentially getting involved in criminal behaviour, and we had this amazing couple get involved with some of the other children just to give them support while mum and professionals tried to focus on the oldest child. And so these volunteers took them out to the park, to great activities, round to their house, and then one of the team had met up with them to review how support was going and had asked the 9-year-old what had been their favourite activity. And he talked about going to the volunteer's house and making pizza and then falling asleep on their sofa. But what was so significant about that was actually the day after their house had been raided by the police, because the 14-year-old had been arrested and they raided the house. So actually, after something so unsettling, the fact that this 9-year-old had been able and felt safe enough to fall asleep on their sofa, just so beautiful. So yeah, I love that. And then another one, just to show the difference in scenarios and ways that we can respond, was a dad with 3 children. He'd fled domestic abuse and was in a kind of hotel room with all 3 kids, struggling, applying for housing, trying to find somewhere where they'd be able to live. And this was when we first met him, and so our family support manager had been talking about how we might be able to help. And just that same week, one of our other staff had had an email from someone saying, because of stuff they were going through, they were emigrating to Australia. They had 3 children, but they had a house full of stuff for 3 children and an adult that they were wondering whether we could use. And it was just, the perfect timing, isn't it? So at this point, one of his housing applications was accepted, and so within 2 weeks of that first meeting, we've been able to fill the house with everything that this dad and 3 children need. It's a beautiful story for the volunteer, because actually, they were moving under pretty tricky circumstances, but the hope that it gave them that their stuff could be used by someone who had absolute need, and for him to suddenly have that sense of, there are people who care. So I guess a really practical example of how people help versus one that's a bit more relational. But yeah, I could go on forever about stories.
Oh, I bet you've got some incredible stories.
Yeah.
So what would be your vision for the future? What change would you like to see overall, big sky thinking?
That no one would feel alone.
Yeah.
That across our communities, families who are struggling and isolated and feeling overwhelmed have the people around them to cheer them on and champion them, and mean that those needs don't escalate and children don't go into care. Almost that Home for Good doesn't need to exist.
Yeah.
And that whole doing ourselves out of business. And that there are, though, enough safe, stable homes in the communities that children are in to ensure that they aren't re-traumatised. And then that across the board, our communities, our churches, our schools are trauma-informed and able to provide those places of welcome for whoever it is that walks through their doors.
Oh, that's incredible. you know, earlier on we talked about the merger between Safe Families and Home for Good. So what do you see? What great things do you see on the horizon for this kind of like these two great organisations working together?
Yeah, we hope to see more families supported, have that hope, support, belonging around them, and reducing the flow of children into care, and enough homes for every child that might need one. In some ways, it's both that simple and that difficult, but we hope that by coming together, we'll be much more than the sum of our parts. We'll have a bigger voice into power to enable the voice of those children and families to be heard by government, and the really significant role of the church in transforming the way that children and families are cared for across our nation, both that we can enable that to be bigger, but also that government can recognise the role of the church in that space.
And, you know, we talked earlier a bit about the church part that the church plays, and so does the church have a particular offering that makes it so different to any other organisation in terms of who you work with?
I think it's in the church's DNA to love the one, to love the vulnerable, because we know the unconditional love of God. We are then equipped and to be able to love unconditionally, and it's not through our strength. And I guess that makes it, you know, when I talk about some of the families that I've come alongside, and at points it feels impossible and hopeless, but actually it's that knowing that we believe in a God who can do more than we can ask or imagine that gives you hope in those situations, that enables you to stand up for justice for the families that don't have it, and to champion them and offer that unconditional love because we were first loved.
Kat, thank you so much. Listening to you has been an enormous inspiration, and I'm sure that all our listeners and viewers will think exactly the same. Safe Families and Home for Good are an incredible organisation, so thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you for your guys' support as benefactor. It makes a huge difference.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.